So we're going to give everybody a few seconds to settle in here. We'll start in just a moment. All right, good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for tuning in again to Velodyne Lidar's digital learning series, Automation and Safety During COVID-19. I'm Pamela Gauci, your host for the next 40 minutes or so, and joining me is my co-host, Mary, who's running slides in the background. Now, today is the last episode of this summer webinar series, but I'll be announcing Velodyne's new fall webinar mini-series at the end of this episode, so be sure to stay tuned. Now, we're super excited to have today's featured guest, Kaarta CEO, Dr. Kevin Dowling. And I'll be introducing Kevin in just a few minutes. But first, a little housekeeping before we begin today. Let's take a quick look at our agenda so you know what to expect. We'll start off with a brief overview on Velodyne Lidar, specifically with a look at our UltraPuck sensor. And then we'll move right into our interview with Kevin for about 30 minutes or so. I'll save the last few minutes for audience Q&A, so be sure to use that Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to ask questions anytime during the episode. As always, we are recording today's episode, which will be available to watch on Velodyne Lidar's YouTube channel. So let's begin. Here, we have a snapshot of a handful of Velodyne's Lidar sensors. All of these sensors provide an essential component for robotic autonomy and navigation. Now, we're going to highlight two of those, the puck and the UltraPuck, both of which are used in a myriad of applications, including advanced safety, robotics, security, and of course, mapping. And Kaarta has integrated both of these sensors into their mobile mapping systems. So now let's dive in a little deeper on the UltraPuck. With 32 channels and a range of up to 200 meters, the UltraPuck generates approximately 1.2 million points per second in dual return mode. And since it's built on Velodyne's 558 patent, it provides a full 360-degree horizontal field of view to deliver accurate real-time 3D data. Add to that a compact footprint, low weight, and interference mitigation features. But what does all of that really mean? It means the UltraPuck can meet customer needs with highly accurate object detection and classification, both critical for robotics and other applications. In this footage, you're seeing the high-density long-range image generated by an UltraPuck on a drive through Nashville, Tennessee. Another notable feature, the Ultra's encapsulated package means it can handle harsh environmental conditions and weather. Additional features include pricing and lower power consumption, allowing for longer operational range and redundancy. And here you really get a sense for just how detailed of a point cloud the Ultra is capable of producing. And here you see the UltraPuck integrated into Kaarta's recently released Stencil Pro. Now, during our interview this morning, Kevin will be telling us more about the amazing things this mobile mapping system is capable of doing. So now I'd like to introduce our featured guest today, Kaarta CEO, Dr. Kevin Dowling. Welcome, Kevin.
Thank you, Pam. It's good to be here.
Awesome. So I'm going to dive right in with the first question here. Can you start off by telling us a little bit about what Kaarta does?
Sure. Kaarta began back in 2015 looking at an old problem in robotics, which is sometimes termed the SLAM problem. It's the determination of the answers to two simple questions: where am I, which is often termed localization, and what's around me, which is the mapping side of it. And this has been solved to some extent in many different ways over the years. And Kaarta took a fresh and new approach to this about 5-6 years ago, the conceptual roots of which were based in some research done at Carnegie Mellon. Since then, we've turned that into products, we've turned that into our business, and we continue to grow as a result.
So cool. Now, there are so many types of applications for Kaarta's mobile mapping products. Can you give us a sense of who today your customers are and the range of industries utilizing Kaarta's technology?
I think the biggest surprise to us was how many applications there were. It's actually almost an issue of business focus where we end up spending our time. But I would say construction, mining, structures and buildings, people who want floor plans and CAD models and BIM models and so forth are the primary ones. We're seeing a surge actually in urban mapping, asset management and so forth, where reality capture matters a great deal and people want high fidelity, both visual and dimensional information. And that, I think, separates Kaarta from many of the other alternatives they may have today. But I think a primary factor in what we can do for them is the speed at which we can accomplish this.
Great. So now, before we talk specifically about one of your mobile mapping systems, can you share with us one of your personal favorite use case examples of how Kaarta systems have been deployed using Velodyne Lidar?
It's a little like choosing your favorite child, but I
You
think
can even give us two if you want.
Sure. Well, there's some interesting ones where Kaarta, thought that it would not be possible, where there was a lot of water. One was a cave of bats, which was a former limestone mine, but it was filled with water. And by putting our systems on a dinghy, a boat, in that area, and this was also true of an island scan that we did recently, where aerial mapping was not allowed because it was a nature reserve. I think it was fascinating to see that, where there's no escape from the motion involved in those types of environments and the absorption by water of the LiDAR instrument itself. But I would say the most interesting one from a business perspective is one we recently did with Swinnerton Construction in California, which combined not only our system, but also a four-legged robot built by Boston Dynamics and change detection software done in progressive scanning by Avir, another partner company. And the combination of all three of these meant that we could do rapid, frequent, progressive scans of an environment. But what was interesting about this application wasn't that we were creating these 3D models. The most interesting thing was how they were using this to run their business. And in terms of progressive scanning, what they could then do is determine whether or not milestones had been completed by subcontractors on the job. And this is may not be well known outside of the construction industry, but it's a significant issue in terms of payment schedules, in terms of making sure the work is done to a satisfactory level. And we were able to provide a combination of tools in order to answer those questions and save the construction company significant amounts of money.
And I believe that they're able to operate that robot remotely, right?
Yes, it's in some cases it's operated remotely, but the robot can also be done autonomously. So it's not actually controlled by a human directly. It's following a designated path through the environment. So eventually it would be fully autonomous. That's right.
It's a really cool use case. And so I'd love to talk a little bit about Stencil Pro specifically, the mobile mapping system Kaarta launched just a couple of months ago. But before we do that, I think this is a good spot to show a brief video about Stencil Pro. So let's take a look at that video before we get started with some questions.
Okay.
That's so cool. You really get a sense of what the Stencil Pro is capable of. So Kevin, can you tell us about the Stencil Pro and why Kaarta refers to it as the quote unquote workhorse of the Kaarta family?
Sure. I loved how Zoom turned that into a Guy Ritchie film with this shadow movement. But right there, you could see many of the types of applications, whether you want to walk or drive with the system. It becomes a very useful tool in many environments. But Stencil Pro is really, it's a consolidation of many of the things that we learned through scanning over the past years in terms of the package and what's integrated into it. And so what you have in there is not only a combination of LiDAR cameras, high definition cameras forming panoramic images in real time, but also an IMU and a fully integrated GNSS system, very nice Trimble system that's able to track and provide RTK and PPK values for the user. So this can be used to both geolocate and geo-align the overall system. But everything is integrated into the Stencil Pro package. And as far as the workhorse designation, it really is. It's really a flagship product that's able to do many things for many types of applications, but still retain that flexibility, mobility, and speed of use in almost any environment.
You mentioned a couple of items, but I will say it's easy to see the Stencil Pro. It's light, it's portable, it's easy to use, but even so, there's some really complex critical hardware in there. Can you give us an idea top to bottom of the different types of hardware that are necessary for a system like this?
Sure. Well, at the very top, you have an antenna, which is for the GNSS system, and that antenna has to be good enough to capture a solid constellation of satellites under many conditions. As you go, one level below that is the Lidar, in this case, the Ultra Puck. It's a 32-line Lidar with 200-meter range. For the outside, especially for open areas, that's necessary to get that kind of distance in order to create good high-fidelity maps of that region. The ring below it, in fact, is comprised of two things. One is 4 high-definition cameras whose images are stitched together in real time by an integrated GPU inside of the Stencil Pro. Secondly, there's a visual odometry camera, which is not currently being used, but will be in the near future. And it's not necessary in most environments. And then below that, inside the package itself, we have the inertial measurement unit that measures the self-motion of the device, much as your smartphone does when you're using it for gaming purposes and other things. And then there's some computation and so forth from that to the control pack, which has the main computing and the main power for the system. It's operated on batteries and can operate continuously by doing hot swapping of batteries while you're scanning.
And now you mentioned both camera and LiDAR. What are some of the advantages of LiDAR over camera?
Boy, you know, cameras are great because you get good visual images. People know how to interpret those images very quickly because we see images all the time, whether they're on our computers or sourced materials and so forth. And then the LiDAR provides geometric information about that environment and sometimes reflectance data, depending on how you use that. I would characterize the difference between the two as cameras estimate. So people use cameras for photogrammetry, for example, but it's subject to lighting conditions, climate conditions, and so forth. So while cameras estimate, LiDARs measure. And I think that's a key distinction between the two types of sensors. But I would also add that it's the powerful combination of multiple sensors that allows us to basically capture a section of the world that the unit is in and use that to create a solid and accurate geometry with both good visual fidelity and very good dimensional fidelity.
And now a system like Stencil Pro deals with massive amounts of data coming from multiple cameras and sensors, and processing that data in real time is really incredibly complex. So that's where the Kaarta Engine comes into play. And so Kaarta Engine, in my opinion, could also be described as Kaarta's crown jewel or your secret sauce. Can you tell everyone what Kaarta Engine is and then why it's so powerful?
Yeah, the software inside, I mean, all of the components that you see, of course, the LiDAR is sourced from Velodyne, but the cameras are also sourced from another vendor and IMUs. We don't design those individual components. We create an assembly and we integrate that into one. So the key difference between what we've provided for our customers is the software, and underlying that software is the Kaarta Engine. And the Kaarta Engine is a purpose-built software set of algorithms that's used for mapping purposes. But it doesn't use ordinary or non-optimal open source solutions. We wholly own our technology and direct the destiny of it. It's the underlying architecture that's as much a key as the algorithms themselves. So this allows us to embed capability for future improvements, and the system is very robust, both in practice and it's consistent in results. You don't need to do constant loops or walk around to your starting point. And if you scan a space multiple times, you'll get very consistent results. And that's not true of all systems in the world today. We have a very interesting approach of scan matching, which helps us to improve the odometry, which is sort of how far we've moved in the world, and stitch all of that together in real time.
It's so cool. And Kaarta Engine, it's present in all of your mapping systems, including the Stencil Pro, right?
That's correct, and as well as our new Kaarta Cloud. That's sort of the underlying software for everything that we do.
Awesome, and we're going to talk. We're talking a little bit about Kaarta Cloud in just a minute, but of course here at Velodyne we love that Kaarta uses only Velodyne sensors on your Stencil products. So can you tell us why Velodyne is the sensor of choice for Kaarta?
Well, as you know, there are many alternatives today in the marketplace, and we keep an eye on that. We do look at all of the LiDARs that are available today from many companies. These companies have continued to improve. However, what we've seen in the Velodyne products is very good, both resolution and as well as consistent accuracies. And I should point out that many people conflate precision and accuracy, and they're not the same thing. Precision is basically repeatability. Are you getting the same answer again and again? And accuracy, is it measured to the true value? And that's what we see in the Velodyne devices today.
Yeah. So would you consider LiDAR to be an essential part of Kaarta's mobile mapping systems, and why?
Yes, because we believe it's the fastest way to be able to capture the overall geometry of a scene in the best fashion possible. And our history in that, by the way, is not just starting with Velodyne. Back in the 80s, when I was building some of the first autonomous vehicles, we used a brand new, very large blue box, which was called a laser radar device. And that was the first one used on an autonomous vehicle. And we used it for close to 10 years in different projects. But that's how it all began. And then later, of course, David Hall and Velodyne came up with some really novel configurations.
Awesome. And so shifting gears a little bit, I do want to say congratulations, because in addition to Stencil Pro, Kaarta recently launched Kaarta Cloud, which you mentioned a little earlier, a service that's actually helping people to work remotely during the COVID crisis. Can you tell us what Kaarta Cloud is, and then how it's helping people work remotely right now?
Well, one of the things you mentioned earlier, Pam, was the massive amount of data that's being produced, and that's actually become a problem. When you have LiDARs that are generating 700,000 or 1 million points per second, IMUs are much less, of course, but cameras, especially high definition cameras, and you have multiples of them, we're now talking significant bandwidths required to even upload a file to your computer or upload to the cloud. The other thing that means, if you want to post-process that to create a better result, and you use the device, that can take as long as the scan or even longer. And what that means is that your utilization rate of that system that you're using then becomes a bottleneck to you for being able to provide additional scans. And so the cloud platform not only allows a collaborative connection with different users who are working on the same project, but it also does that post-processing. It can be used for modeling purposes to give you BIM and CAD models, floor plans and the like. And then finally, storage and visualization. So it's easily accessible and easily visualized. So that's the importance of Kaarta Cloud.
And before I get to the next question, we do have a brief video showing visualization of a Velodyne UltraPug PCAP file that's been processed and optimized in Kaarta Cloud. So I think this is a great place to show that video. Let's take a look. So it really is pretty amazing. So Kevin, can you tell us, how does the combination of Kaarta Cloud and Velodyne Lidar make mobile mapping more accessible to people?
Well, that was a great example right there. That is not a scan that we did. It's a scan of an area in Silicon Valley, and done only with a Velodyne Lidar. So the post-processing of that was done in Kaarta Cloud. The visualization that you just saw was also revealed through Kaarta Cloud. Kaarta Cloud can also be used on your phone. And so there are many ways in which you can easily adapt and use this in a collaborative fashion. But I think the important thing there was that the underlying algorithms don't necessarily need the system, depending on the fidelity and accuracy that you need in that. But the overall importance of Kaarta Cloud is to not only do the post-processing, but take it all the way to visualization, take it all the way to making it easily accessible to anyone in the world through simply providing a link or even providing access to it so it can be manipulated in some ways for specific purposes that you may need.
And that's subscription-based, is that correct?
That's correct. Yeah, it's a very simple subscription-based model, and we're evaluating other ways too in which people can have access to and use that. So it does not necessarily, and I want to emphasize this, it doesn't necessarily have to be through a Kaarta system that the Kaarta Cloud is used. It can be through a standalone Lidar, and we have many plans for the future to make it even more accessible to people.
Great. And now I'm curious, were there any special challenges? You launched 2 products during the COVID crisis. Any special challenges launching products during the COVID crisis versus pre-COVID, or was that the same experience?
No, it was definitely different. I would say on the technical development end, though, things went surprisingly well. So our company went in the very first week of March. We all went home and operated remotely. Due to some background reasons, but in that we were able to find ways to work effectively and efficiently. And while many of us live near our headquarters in Pittsburgh, we already had a number of remote employees, and that's obviously a very common thing these days. So those folks who sort of knew how to operate remotely, probably the toughest challenge was because engineers typically will need the hardware in order to run and operate, and was making sure that people had the tools that they needed at home in order to be able to get their job done. So that was one of the main challenges. Communication, we're obviously right here now using Zoom, and that's become the de facto standard almost across many companies, but also Slack and other tools, email, phone, and so forth. So I think the world is shifting toward that, and we're no different in that respect. However, in terms of sales, our product is such that it requires sort of high contact and interaction with customers. And what that means is we have to find an alternative to actually flying there, being on site, and showing in person. And we've come up with a variety of strategies around the sales side in order to present these systems to our customers, in some cases providing training and support, as well as introductions and demonstrations. So all of that together meant that we had to find ways to operate remotely and keep people safe. That was our primary concern, and but also try to be as effective as we can in spite of that.
Sure. Now, you mentioned Pittsburgh, which is where Kaarta is located. And Pittsburgh is becoming a robotics hotspot because of its rich robotics history. Carnegie Mellon is one of the reasons for this. It's also where you spent 2 decades as a student, research engineer, and a scientist at the prestigious Field Robotics Center. Can you tell us what prompted your interest in robotics and also what drew you to Kaarta?
Oh boy, well, my interest in robotics stems to being a young kid with a construction set and building stuff in my backyard and trying not to hurt myself or too many people in the process. But when I went to Carnegie Mellon as an undergraduate, I found that they were creating this robotics institute, of which the Field Robotics Center is part of. And it was and still is the best place in the world to learn about robotics. And robotics is so interesting to me because it involves the integration of systems. So it encourages system thinking, where the integration of technology is as important as the technology itself. And so that, that's where many of us grew up, and we learned a great deal and still do. And the people there we still stay in close touch with and work closely with. But Pittsburgh has become, I would say, has become the hotbed of AI and robotics in the world. And there are over 100 companies here now doing AI and robotics. And many of the self-driving car companies, the autonomous vehicle companies, are based here, or at least have significant satellite outposts here. So we've been watching autonomous vehicles for decades here, and it's fun to see the fleet grow.
Well, and Kaarta it's growing so fast. and you're really attracting a lot of attention. Can you comment on investor interest in Kaarta?
Yes, we've been able to grow without a lot of investment, but we still have to talk to the investor community in the street and so forth, as any venture-backed company does. And the interest in Kaarta has been high. What we're doing technically and in our business is identifying new opportunities, and even more in a collective sense, not just Kaarta, but this whole area of Lidar, three-dimensional modeling, autonomous vehicles, robotics, of which we have a number of customers as well, is becoming so important and growing very, very quickly. So there are huge opportunities, and of course that attracts investors and subsequently investment as well. So.
Great, and so I have time for one final question before we go to audience Q&A. Just a small question. Can you tell us a little bit about Kaarta's vision for the future of mobile mapping, of what you think the industry could look like in a few years?
I would say, there's the usual about we'd love better sensors, less expensive sensors and so forth, but which will help drive the market. But in general, if you look at the evolution of this market from the tripod mounted LiDARs that are still being widely used today to Kaarta systems and other systems in the market like that, it's increasing the flexibility and mobility and the speed of these systems, getting to the answer faster. And how do you get to that answer in an efficient and effective way? It also means that we have to think about user interfaces. A lot of our customers are not trained surveyors, where they have to go to school for several years to learn how to do their job correctly. We're trying to enable folks with very little training who can do measurements. It doesn't mean it'll be grounded or signed off by a professional engineer or a professional surveyor, but it does mean that you can get a lot of interesting jobs done today using those types of systems. So the evolution is rapidly moving toward the speed, flexibility, and mobility of these types of systems. And the sensors we use, the computers we use. I'd say one technology that does matter to us a great deal, we have some activity in this space already with some telecoms, is 5G. The data sets I spoke about earlier, in order to transfer them, we need something that's much faster than cell modems and Wi-Fi and even direct connections to your local internet provider. We have data sets that are well over 250 gig. Some are upwards of 500 gigabytes. And in order to move that kind of file around requires a significant bandwidth. And so we're very anxiously looking at that and working with companies that are in that space.
Awesome. And so we're going to move to audience Q&A now. And first question here we have, do you work with customers outside of the US?
Oh, yes. In fact, about 2/3 of our business is overseas. Kaarta went international from the very beginning, so that was a very much a thrust area for us, is to build our international presence. So we have distribution all over the world. We're still growing that. We just signed up 4 new distributors and resellers very recently. And we want to sign up many more. We're finding actually early adopters, especially in the APAC region, are taking on the technology. As opposed to saying what it can't do, they're looking at what it can do. And that's a key insight to growing this business. And I don't mean just Kaarta's either. I mean, there's a lot of room here in these markets.
Yeah. So next question we have is, are there any technology gaps that you see hindering Kaarta's growth?
That's a good question. We would love even better IMUs, for example, for self-motion. With LiDARs, I can say we're always looking for more data, better data, longer range data. And the companies in that business, of course, including Velodyne, are being responsive to that and pushing hard on the envelope of that. There's some underlying physics, however, that limit what you can do with time of flight sensors. But there are other technologies that people are coming up with and making advances in packaging, in the underlying algorithms for those particular sensors. There's algorithms at every level. It's turtles all the way down, right? You have, algorithms and techniques being used at the chip level all the way to the system level. And we recognize how we can best make use of all of that. So the technologies we would love to see are also related to how these sensors are used, creating panoramic imagery. We sort of had to integrate our own system there, but I think rapidly in the not too distant future, you'll see fully integrated sensors with that. It means less work for us on the hardware development and more on the software development, which is really our strength.
So I have a question here about renting. Can you rent Kaarta's mobile mapping systems, or do you have to purchase them?
No, we started out with primarily doing purchasing, but we recognized that some people wanted to try them out before you buy it, and we established a rental program well over a year and a half ago, and that's been very successful. So we've been able to get it in people's hands, get them using it. We always have to be careful and make sure that, this is not, like the old Kodak camera, the Brownie, one button and go scan. There are some techniques to improve your scanning, and we want to make sure people are successful. So we encourage some training, and that can be done remotely as well. Let's see. Secondly, we're also looking at some businesses like construction, for example, primarily work on operating leases. They don't want to see assets on the balance sheet. And so they primarily do leasing arrangements, and they do this for capital equipment all the time. So there's also financing options too. So there's a lot of different ways to get it in the hands of customers at a very economical manner.
And so now this one you touched on, I think, briefly earlier. Do you need a Kaarta mapping system to use Kaarta Cloud? And if not, what do you need?
Oh, yes. You do not need that. You can use a LiDAR. We have some recommendations on how to best use that data, but in fact, not many people know because we never really advertised it, but we've always had a portal on our website that you could submit raw PCAP files from a LiDAR and see how we can provide registration of that data and produce you a resultant map from that. So we've done that for over 5 years. Regarding the use of Kaarta Cloud with that, we've already ported that piece with some significant improvements to Kaarta Cloud so that you can also use the Kaarta Cloud without requiring you to have a Kaarta system. We do recommend the Kaarta system for if you have special needs or you have specific criteria, perhaps dimensional criteria that you need to adhere to, then we recommend our instruments as well. But our primary interest is in developing Kaarta Cloud to the point where anyone can use it for whatever purpose they need.
Awesome. So I have a few questions here specifically about Stencil Pro. I'll ask, how much does a system like Stencil Pro weigh, and how big is it?
It weighs about 4 to 5 kilograms. Sometimes that depends on the antenna that you use and so forth, or certain options. I'm sorry, you mentioned the cost or the weight and
the weight and the size, which we saw in the video a bit.
Yeah, you could sort of see it. Those were not giant people. They were, normal human scale people. So it stands tall, and it can be easily mounted on a pole. If you're going to be scanning for long periods of time, we do recommend the belts that you see drum majors use, for example, in bands, and that you can simply hold it and walk for hours that way. But remember that we can scan so quickly that even large areas can be scanned quite rapidly, so you don't really suffer from having to carry it for many hours unless you choose to. I would say one of the longest scans done manually was the arboreal ring around the ancient city of Pompeii. That was a 6-hour hike around that, but we were the only ones able to capture the whole of that ring, and that had been tried by several other companies before then. But that was done in a 6-hour scan that was well over 200, almost 300 gigabytes of data. And wow. The really interesting thing was that they were able to, from that map that we had created, identify the trees and then create a census of all of the trees and materials in that area. I hope I answered that question.
I think so, and that's pretty amazing use case as well. I have a question here that ties into that on charges. How long does a single charge last on the Stencil Pro, and how long does it take to recharge it?
So we use a type of battery which is common in the cinematography industry, the film industry, called a V-mount battery, and those can be swapped, hot swapped. And you'll be able to do continuous scanning as long as you have chargeable batteries. So our current system uses 2 of those batteries. So you can pull one off if it's depleted and then pop another one in that's fully charged. And so that doesn't limit your scanning capability with the Stencil Pro. On a single battery, you can get ones even over 100 watt hours. So you can go for a couple of hours minimum with that type of battery. We switched to this modular type of battery because it's readily accessible all over the world. So you have less issues with transportation requirements that you often see with batteries, and it's a very easy to use, easy to clip on and clip off type of system as well.
Great. And I have a question here about, since you started at Kaarta, what have been the biggest advancements that you've seen in this industry happen?
Oh, I think the biggest advance has been the acceptance of SLAM-based systems for use in mapping. There were only a couple of commercial entities doing this. The first company I know that used LiDAR for mapping purposes was stationary. It was back in the 80s, called QuantaPoint. Subsequently, there were other companies that have since been acquired. This industry has grown immensely. In the past decade alone, you're seeing a lot of activity, not only at the scanning level. So there are scanning companies, there are scanning components like LiDAR, there are companies building the devices. So it's created an entire ecosystem of companies and some really amazing capabilities, being able to wander through a heritage site and capture it in real time as you walk through it to very good quality. The other big advancement, I think, is in the quality of the output of these systems. One other thing I would add to this, people often try to position this type of technology, the SLAM technology, as an either-or solution, and it's not. We can partner with other devices and other systems in the world, whether you're using a tripod laser system, a TLS, or whether you're using a total station to verify accuracies, or using photogrammetry and aerial. We have many examples of all of these where you're able to combine, and the way we like to put it is we play well with others, right? We have purposely created systems where we can easily integrate this with other sources of information. And I think that's a huge advancement, both in terms of acceptance of this technology and in the use of it.
Awesome. So I have time for one more audience question. What are some of the added features Stencil Pro has over previous Stencil versions?
Oh, a great question. One I don't think I mentioned well was it's rugged. The previous Stencil version, which is lightweight, it's really meant for flight options or walking around for long periods of time, is not really IP rated. The Stencil Pro is rated IP65, which means it can be used in inclement weather, dusty conditions, and more. We have many examples where people want to use our systems on construction sites and caves and mines where that's a big challenge. But overall, I'd say that the biggest pieces are the integration of some advanced processing. The Stencil Pro is also the first system in which we used hardware acceleration, not necessarily in the form of ASICs or FPGAs, but we are using a GPU on board. And this allows us to stitch the panoramic imagery in real time while also storing the raw images themselves. The significant advances that have happened in computing and memory have meant that we can do more and more on board as well. So I'd say there's a combination of things. It's not any one thing.
Awesome. So now, Kevin, we're unfortunately out of time. Now, if we didn't get to your question, that's no problem because you have our contact information right there on your screen. So you can reach out to us directly with any questions about Kaarta's mobile mapping solutions and Kaarta Cloud or Velodyne Lidar and our LiDAR sensors. Again, this webinar recording will be available to view on Velodyne Lidar's YouTube channel. I do want to thank Kevin Dowling again. Thank you so much for spending your morning with us, Kevin.
Thank you, Pam. Thank you and your whole team.
Awesome. Now, I want to thank our audience as well for joining us today. Now, I mentioned earlier that this is the last episode of this webinar series, but don't worry because we'll be back in the fall with a new webinar series. And in the meantime, we're launching our WSS webinar mini-series with our first episode premiering on Friday, September 11th at 10 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. This mini-series is the warm-up leading to Velodyne's annual World Safety Summit on Autonomous Technology, which takes place on October 22nd. For the first time, we are partnering with Western automotive journalists and their annual event, Silicon Valley Reinvents the Wheel. Now, we were originally planning to have a physical event, but due to COVID-19, like most other events, we'll be going all virtual in 2020. So be sure to stay tuned for more details over the coming weeks. Thank you again for tuning in the past few months, and we're super excited to see you again in the fall. Thank you so much.
Thanks.